Welcome. Before we dive into this shocking story, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because we've spent countless hours digging into the true events behind this terrifying tale. This story is about a mother whose children were cruelly sold, and the unimaginable actions she took next, actions that no one could have predicted. The story begins with a mother whose life was already filled with hardship long before the tragedy that would define her. She was born into a world where her every action was controlled, her freedom limited, and her family's fate dictated by those with power over her. From a young age, she learned the harsh realities of servitude, understanding that love, protection, and safety were luxuries she could never take for granted. Her days were consumed by labor, her nights haunted by fear, and yet, despite the oppressive weight of her circumstances, she nurtured a fierce determination to survive and protect those she loved most, her children. Her children were the light in her otherwise dark world, small sparks of joy in a life governed by cruelty and exploitation. She watched over them with vigilance, teaching them lessons of caution, compassion, and resilience, even in the face of constant danger. Each child carried a piece of her heart, and she knew that losing any one of them would be unbearable. She spent her days toiling in the fields, and her nights keeping a close eye on her little ones, ensuring they were fed, safe, and hidden from the eyes of those who would see them as property rather than human beings. Her maternal instinct was her greatest strength, a force that guided every decision she made, every step she took, and every risk she calculated. Despite her efforts, the cruel reality of her time made it clear that her love alone could not shield her family from the dangers surrounding them. Those in positions of power saw her children not as extensions of her life, but as commodities, assets that could be bought and sold to settle debts, secure favors, or exercise control over her. The constant threat of separation weighed on her like a shadow she could never shake. Every transaction she witnessed, every negotiation she overheard about her children's futures, carved a deeper wound in her heart, teaching her that no one could be trusted when the stakes involved human lives. She learned early that survival required vigilance, cunning, and sometimes deception. She watched the patterns of her oppressors, noting their weaknesses, their obsessions, and the ways they justified cruelty. She began to understand that in a world that offered no justice for the powerless, her children's lives could only be protected if she learned to operate within the shadows, observing, waiting, and planning. Her intelligence and awareness became her silent weapon, invisible to those around her yet powerful enough to shape her destiny in ways that no one expected. At the heart of her struggle was not just the fear of losing her children, but the knowledge that once they were gone, she would lose her very reason to exist. Every plan she made, every small victory she achieved, was motivated by the unwavering goal of keeping her family together. She knew that in order to protect them, she might have to make choices that were dangerous, even unthinkable, and that the consequences could ripple far beyond herself. But her maternal resolve was unyielding. Love in her eyes was more than an emotion, it was a strategy, a weapon, and the only thing worth fighting for in a world built on injustice. Her life before the tragedy also shaped her into someone capable of the extraordinary. She had survived hunger, cruelty, and betrayal before. She had endured the loss of friends, the death of those close to her, and the daily indignities of being treated as less than human. Each hardship honed her mind, sharpened her instincts, and fortified her resolve. By the time the unimaginable event occurred, the sale of her children for 1,000 zaluzand, she was ready in ways no one could have anticipated. Her past had been a preparation for this moment, a crucible that forged the courage and cunning that would soon leave an indelible mark on the history of those who witnessed her actions. In short, her life before the tragedy was not just a backdrop, it was the foundation of everything that followed. It was a life defined by oppression but tempered by intelligence, resilience, and a love so fierce that no law, no transaction, and no act of cruelty could destroy it. She was a mother in the true sense, willing to endure, to fight, and to plan with a patience that would shock those who believed they controlled her fate. And it was this preparation, this quiet strength cultivated in years of hardship, that allowed her to respond to the unthinkable act of losing her children with actions that would astound everyone and cement her story in history. Her early life was a testament to the idea that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can prepare itself for the impossible, and that sometimes the smallest and most oppressed among us can wield a power far beyond what the world believes possible. The events leading to the sale of her children for 1,000 began with circumstances that at the time were all too common yet devastatingly personal. The mother had worked tirelessly for years, supporting her family and keeping her children safe, despite the constant pressures of oppression and exploitation. But even the most vigilant parent could not control the whims and greed of those in positions of power, and her life was about to be altered in a way she could never have prepared for. It started with debts her master had accrued, sums of money owed to creditors that could not be repaid through ordinary means. In his mind, her children were not little humans, not extensions of her life, not beings with feelings, needs, or futures. To him they were currency. One evening, after a heated argument over unpaid debts and the value of property, the decision was made her children would be sold. The sum of 1,000 was agreed upon, a fortune for him, an unbearable heartbreak for her. The very thought of it left her feeling as if the air had been ripped from her lungs. The day of the sale was marked by tension, so thick it seemed to press against the walls of her modest quarters. She watched helplessly as her children were led away, their small hands slipping through hers, their frightened eyes locking on hers in a silent plea for protection. The transaction was swift, clinical, and cruel. The money changed hands, and with it, her children's lives were transferred to strangers who cared nothing for their well-being, their hopes, or their futures. The mother's grief was a visceral, all-consuming force, one that clutched at her heart and refused to let go. Yet in the midst of this unimaginable tragedy, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She refused to be paralyzed by grief, refusing to allow despair to dictate her actions. Instead, she began to observe, to calculate, and to plan. She studied the men who had taken her children, noting their routines, their weaknesses, and the ways in which they moved about their world. Every gesture, every word, every detail became a potential tool for reclaiming what had been stolen from her. She understood that brute force was not an option. She was alone, surrounded by those who wielded power without conscience. But she also understood that intelligence, cunning, and patience could be weapons far more effective than any physical strength. During the following days, she carefully mapped out her approach. She questioned neighbors subtly, listened to gossip, and noted the times when her children's new owners would be distracted. Her strategy required patience, timing, and a courage that few could comprehend. Every decision had to be calculated, because a single misstep could cost her even more than she had already lost. It could cost her life. And yet, the bond she had with her children, the fierce maternal instinct that had guided her through years of hardship, gave her the determination to act. At the same time, her knowledge of her community's social and economic dynamics played a crucial role. She understood that appearances mattered, that the men who had taken her children relied on public perception to maintain their authority. By blending into the background, observing the laws and expectations of her environment, she could maneuver in ways that would remain unseen. Her cunning was born not of malice but of desperation, a mother's desperation to undo the greatest wrong she had ever experienced. The sale of her children was not just a transactional event. It was a pivotal moment that transformed her grief into action. It marked the point where sorrow met strategy, where the powerless began to harness the one resource they had in abundance: intellect and resolve. She realized that, despite the overwhelming odds, she still had agency. She could still influence events, even if the odds seemed insurmountable. That realization fueled every choice she made in the days, weeks, and months that followed. Ultimately, the circumstances leading to the sale were a convergence of greed, oppression, and societal norms that treated human beings as commodities. But within those circumstances, the mother's response revealed a depth of courage and intelligence that would shock everyone who witnessed the consequences. What began as a moment of unspeakable loss would become the catalyst for a series of actions so bold, so cunning, and so daring that they would leave a permanent mark on history, not as a tale of submission to injustice, but as a testament to resilience, strategy, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children. This pivotal moment, the sale of her children for $10,000, set the stage for everything that came next. It was the moment her grief became fuel, her despair became focus, and her maternal love became a force capable of challenging the cruelty of an entire system. And though the world around her saw only the transaction, only the exchange of money for human lives, she saw the opening for resistance, for reclamation, and for an act that no one could have anticipated. The mother's immediate reaction to the sale of her children was a storm of emotions that no one could have predicted, and it would ultimately define the course of her life from that moment onward. When she realized what had happened, the crushing weight of grief struck her like a physical blow. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer pounding against her chest, and her world seemed to tilt as if the very ground beneath her had disappeared. Shock gave way to despair, despair gave way to anger, and anger slowly transformed into a burning determination. She refused to be a passive victim of the system that had torn her family apart. Her first hours after the sale were spent in disbelief. She questioned whether what she had witnessed was real or some cruel nightmare. She replayed the moment in her mind over and over, recalling the exchanged money, the cold hands of the men who had taken her children, and the wide, frightened eyes of the little ones as they were carried away. Every detail was etched into her memory like a brand. She couldn't scream, couldn't lash out physically. There were too many men, too much risk, but her mind raced. She needed a plan, a strategy, something to counteract the injustice that had just been done. In her solitude, she began to observe her surroundings with a new clarity. Every person around her, every routine, every pattern of movement became important. She listened to conversations in hushed tones, noting the weaknesses and habits of those who had taken her children. She watched the guards, the overseers, and even casual bystanders, storing information in her mind like a ledger of opportunity. The maternal instinct that had once guided her in everyday care now sharpened into a tool of survival and revenge. She understood that brute force alone could not reclaim her children. She would have to be clever, patient, and utterly precise. Anger fueled her actions, but it was disciplined anger. She did not act recklessly, knowing that even the smallest misstep could result in her own death or the permanent loss of her children. She spent hours planning, considering every possible scenario, how she could reach them, how she could manipulate situations to her advantage, and how she could turn the very power structures that oppressed her against themselves. In that moment, grief became purpose, and purpose became a quiet, simmering form of power that would guide her through the days ahead. Her emotional state was also shaped by the community around her. Some sympathized with her plight, offering small words of comfort or advice, while others avoided her, fearful that the consequences of her situation might spill over into their own lives. She learned quickly whom she could trust and whom she could not, building a mental map of allies and potential obstacles. Every interaction became a piece of the puzzle, every conversation a potential insight into the movements of those who held her children captive. Yet, beneath her anger and grief, there was a layer of deep sorrow and reflection. She thought about the lives of her children, what they had endured, how they must have felt, and the trauma they would carry. That sorrow was not passive. It became a guiding force, shaping her decisions with precision and care. She knew that reclaiming her children would require more than anger. It would require strategy, foresight, and an understanding of human nature that few possessed. Her grief sharpened her perception, making her acutely aware of every risk and opportunity. Her first actions were subtle but deliberate. She began to gather information quietly, listening for hints about where her children were taken and what routines governed their new lives. She observed the behavior of those around her, noting inconsistencies, weaknesses, and moments of negligence. Each small observation became a building block in a larger plan, a blueprint for an operation that no one could anticipate. She understood that patience would be her greatest weapon, that acting too soon, too recklessly, would doom her efforts. At the same time, her grief pushed her to find emotional allies. She confided in a few trusted friends, people who understood the cruelty of the system and could provide information or assistance without exposing her. Together, they began to map out possibilities, exchange intelligence, and consider how to turn circumstances to her advantage. Each conversation, each piece of information, brought her closer to the realization that the system that had stolen her children also had vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities were the key to reclaiming what was hers. In essence, her immediate reaction, a mixture of grief, anger, and calculated determination, set the stage for what would follow. She was no longer a passive victim. She was an active strategist, a mother whose love transcended fear and danger. Her emotional response became a catalyst, transforming sorrow into action, despair into cunning, and loss into a driving force that would ultimately shock those who had underestimated her. The combination of her intellect, maternal instinct, and unrelenting determination made it clear that the events of that day were only the beginning, and what she did next would leave an enduring mark on everyone who witnessed the consequences of her extraordinary courage. The secretive plan she devised in response to the cruel sale of her children was born out of necessity, desperation, and an unyielding love that refused to be broken. She knew that rushing into open confrontation would guarantee disaster. The men who had taken her children were powerful, merciless, and accustomed to bending others to their will. Brute force or open rebellion was not an option. Instead, she relied on patience, observation, and cunning. Every step she took had to be deliberate, every movement calculated, because one mistake could cost her not only her chance to reclaim her children, but also her very life. She began by carefully studying the routines of those who had purchased or were in control of her children. She memorized the times they left their homes, the guards assigned to watch over them, and the private habits that hinted at weakness or distraction. Even small details, like the placement of doors, the routes people took through the fields, or the times when conversations revealed their preoccupations, were catalogued in her mind. To her, these were not trivial observations. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, a map that would eventually allow her to strike with precision. Her plan also required patience. She waited for moments when the adults around her were distracted or complacent, times when the oversight of her children's whereabouts would lapse. She learned to blend into the background, to speak softly, to act inconspicuous, and to mask the storm of grief and fury that raged inside her. Every interaction she had with neighbors, overseers, and even the merchants who had bought her children became an opportunity to gather information, to test boundaries, and to find vulnerabilities. She became invisible, yet ever present, a shadow moving through a world that did not suspect her awareness or cunning. She also relied on the few allies she could trust. People who had suffered under the same oppressive system, who had witnessed her dedication and intelligence, became her confidants. They provided information, suggested strategies, and occasionally acted as decoys or messengers. Her network was small but reliable, and it was built on the shared understanding that they were operating outside the law and outside the moral codes of a society built on exploitation. Trust was scarce, and betrayal was a constant threat, but she carefully selected those whose loyalty had been proven over time. Part of her plan was psychological, to anticipate how the men who controlled her children would react under pressure or when faced with uncertainty. She knew they relied on fear and intimidation to maintain control, and she understood that a subtle display of cunning or unpredictability could shift the balance in her favor. By acting in ways that they did not expect, by remaining calm when others might falter, and by exploiting their assumptions about her powerlessness, she could create openings to regain her children without engaging in direct confrontation. The plan was also adaptive. She knew that circumstances could change at any moment, and that flexibility was essential. If one opportunity failed, she would adjust her approach, learning from mistakes and recalculating the risks. This adaptability required mental fortitude and relentless focus, qualities that had been honed through years of survival under the harshest conditions. Every setback was analyzed, every observation incorporated, and every success carefully measured against the next step in her strategy. Emotionally, her secret plan was fueled by a mixture of love, rage, and determination. Each day without her children strengthened her resolve, making her more patient, more observant, and more willing to endure the hardship of waiting for the right moment. She channeled her grief into strategy, allowing her emotions to guide her focus without overwhelming her judgment. This balance between emotional intensity and calculated planning was what made her plan both secretive and extraordinarily effective. Finally, her plan was rooted in moral clarity. She was fully aware that society would not view her actions as justified. She could expect no help from the law, no sympathy from those in power, and no protection from the community that had long turned a blind eye to injustice. Yet her actions were guided by a higher principle, the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children. Every risk she took, every step she planned, was justified in her mind by the imperative to reclaim what was stolen from her, to restore her family, and to assert her agency in a world that had denied her both humanity and power. In essence, the secretive plan she devised was not a single action, but a series of calculated moves, informed by observation, intelligence, and relentless love. It required patience, cunning, discretion, and adaptability, all qualities she had honed over years of surviving in a harsh and unforgiving world. This plan would eventually set in motion events that stunned those who believed they controlled her children's fate, and demonstrated that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, one person's determination and ingenuity could defy expectation and alter destiny itself. The consequences of her actions for the family and community were profound, far-reaching, and unpredictable. What she did in response to the sale of her children did not merely affect the immediate parties involved. It rippled outward, touching lives in ways that no one at the time could have anticipated. Her courage and ingenuity reshaped relationships, unsettled the established order, and left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed, directly or indirectly, the extraordinary lengths she was willing to go to reclaim her children. For her own family, the immediate consequence was a mix of relief, awe, and lingering fear. Her children, who had been taken from her by force and treated as property, were restored to her care. But the experience left indelible marks. The trauma of being separated and sold lingered in their young minds, influencing their behavior, emotions, and perception of the world. Yet alongside that trauma came an overwhelming sense of security, knowing that their mother had defied impossible odds to bring them back. The act of reclaiming her children created a bond that was both strengthened and tested, a bond forged in adversity and tempered by the knowledge that their survival depended on their mother's intelligence and courage. For the mother herself, the consequences were equally complex. While she achieved the ultimate goal of reuniting her family, she also became a figure of both admiration and fear within her community. Her actions demonstrated that a single person, driven by love and resolve, could disrupt the expectations of those in power. People who had once assumed her submission now saw a force that could not be ignored. Someone capable of extraordinary planning, audacity, and courage. At the same time, she became a target of gossip, suspicion, and even resentment. Her defiance of societal norms challenged the established hierarchy and made others question their own positions and loyalties. The broader community felt the effects as well. Plantation owners and other individuals who profited from the exploitation of the powerless became wary, recognizing that even those they considered weak could act with precision and cunning when motivated by necessity. Her story spread quietly but powerfully, serving as a warning that cruelty and greed could be met with consequences far beyond what anyone expected. Neighbors whispered about her bravery, speculated on the methods she employed, and reconsidered the assumptions they had long held about control and authority. In some ways, her actions disrupted the status quo, revealing vulnerabilities in a system that had seemed absolute. Her actions also carried legal and moral implications. While the law offered no protection for the powerless and condoned the sale of human beings, her defiance raised questions that could not easily be ignored. By acting outside the law, she exposed the fragility of a system that relied on unquestioned compliance and the silencing of the oppressed. Those who witnessed her success, both directly and indirectly, were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. That morality and justice were not necessarily aligned with legality, and that courage could overturn circumstances that seemed immutable. Additionally, the ripple effect reached other families who had once been complacent in the face of injustice. They saw that one person's decisive action could challenge oppression, and for some, it inspired hope, while for others it provoked fear. Some families quietly supported her, offering assistance or sympathy, while others distanced themselves, unwilling to risk association. Communities are shaped as much by collective fear as by collective courage, and her actions introduced a new, unpredictable element into the social fabric, one that would linger for years to come. On a psychological level, her actions changed the perception of power and possibility within her environment. People who had previously accepted oppression as inevitable now realized that strategic thinking, courage, and relentless determination could overcome formidable obstacles. The boundaries of what was considered achievable expanded, not just for her family, but for all those who witnessed or heard of her triumph. The fear she had instilled in the men who had taken her children became a cautionary tale, a reminder that cruelty could provoke resistance with consequences that could not be controlled. Finally, the long-term consequences were evident in the legacy she left behind. Her story became a testament to the power of maternal love, intelligence, and perseverance. It served as a lesson to future generations, not only about the horrors of a system that commodified human life, but also about the extraordinary lengths a parent would go to protect their children. The consequences of her actions were not merely immediate. They echoed through time, shaping the narratives of courage, resistance, and resilience that her community would pass down, quietly but insistently, to ensure that her deeds were remembered. In short, the consequences of her actions were multifaceted, affecting her family, challenging the community, unsettling those in power, and leaving an enduring legacy. What began as a personal act of defiance grew into a story that reshaped perceptions, altered behavior, and demonstrated that even in the harshest conditions, courage and ingenuity could transform tragedy into a powerful testament of human strength. The enduring legacy of her story, as a tale of shocking courage and calculated defiance, is one that resonates far beyond the immediate events of her time. What she accomplished in reclaiming her children was not merely a personal victory. It became a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and the unyielding strength of a mother's love in the face of overwhelming adversity. The story persisted, passed down in hushed tones, whispered from one generation to the next, embedding itself into the collective memory of the community, and eventually becoming part of the broader historical narrative of resistance against oppression. Her actions challenged the accepted notions of power and authority in a society structured around cruelty and control. By outwitting those who sought to exploit her, she demonstrated that courage and strategy could triumph where brute force and submission had previously failed. The people who witnessed or heard of her actions could not ignore the implications. One individual, driven by love and fortified by intelligence, could defy a system designed to crush the powerless. This realization subtly shifted the social dynamics of her environment, inspiring hope in some and fear in others, and proving that the human spirit could not be fully contained, even under the harshest conditions. The story also endured because it highlighted the moral and emotional dimensions of human action that law and society often ignored. The men who sold her children may have viewed the transaction as a simple business deal, a matter of profit and debt, but her response reframed the narrative entirely. It forced the community to confront the injustice inherent in treating human lives as commodities, and it elevated the mother's actions from mere survival to a profound statement of ethical and emotional truth. Her courage was not only a response to personal loss, but also a challenge to the broader social and moral fabric, questioning the legitimacy of a system that condoned such cruelty. Generations later, her story became a touchstone for those seeking examples of resistance and maternal devotion in the face of injustice. Historians, writers, and storytellers drew from her example, using it to illuminate the lived experiences of individuals who resisted oppression in subtle, strategic, and sometimes extraordinary ways. It became a narrative that celebrated intellect as much as courage, showing that acts of resistance need not always involve physical confrontation. Sometimes, the most profound defiance is executed through patience, observation, and precise planning. Her legacy is also deeply human, reflecting the universal themes of love, loss, and resilience. People continue to be moved by the intensity of her devotion to her children, the lengths she was willing to go to protect them, and the extraordinary skill with which she navigated impossible circumstances. The story resonates because it transcends its historical context, speaking to the innate drive of any parent to safeguard their offspring, the capacity of ordinary individuals to rise to extraordinary challenges, and the enduring power of hope and determination even in the darkest times. Moreover, the narrative of her courage challenges stereotypes and assumptions about those who lived under oppression. It reveals that intelligence, agency, and moral courage were never absent from those whose lives were constrained by unjust systems. The mother's story exemplifies how marginalized individuals could assert influence and effect change, even when society sought to render them powerless. In this way, her legacy is not just about a single act of defiance, but about a broader lesson that resilience and ingenuity can flourish even in environments designed to suppress them. Finally, the enduring impact of her story is reflected in its continued relevance and power to inspire. Modern audiences, when introduced to her actions, are struck not only by the audacity of her plan, but by the depth of emotion, strategy, and courage it required. Her legacy lives on in the ways it challenges readers and listeners to consider what they might do in the face of extreme injustice, what lengths they would go to protect loved ones, and how acts of intelligence and bravery can ripple far beyond their immediate context. In summary, the mother's story left a lasting mark because it transformed personal tragedy into a powerful lesson of courage, intelligence, and love. It became a symbol of resistance, a testament to human ingenuity, and a reminder that even in a world dominated by cruelty and oppression, one person's determination can change the course of lives, communities, and history itself. Her legacy is timeless, a story of shocking courage that continues to inspire and provoke reflection, demonstrating the extraordinary potential of ordinary individuals when driven by love and the refusal to accept injustice.